Welcome everybody to the April 3rd, 2025 meeting of the Technical Advisory Council of the Confidential Computing Consortium. If this is your first time here, we are an open and collaborative group. Everybody's welcome to contribute constructively here. We also are required to abide by the antitrust policy of the Linux Foundation, and you can see that on the linuxfoundation.org website at the antitrust-policy URL. Today, we've got a pretty packed schedule. Not a whole lot on the announcements, but we do have the NARC's annual project update. We've got Richard on for that. Appreciate you joining, Richard. We'll have maybe a short interlude to talk about the status of the ISO topic that's been on the TAC mail list. If we have Alec for that. Trying to remember if Alex sent a note beforehand that he won't be on. I don't see him on at the moment. So we might end up stepping over that. And then we have a introduction to the security baselines from OpenSSF from Emily Fox. And Emily will be joining us at the top of the hour. And then we also have maybe some time then to check in on the liaison status, depending on how we're tracking either before or after Emily's talk. And then we're also scheduled to have a tech talk from Brian Kelly at Microsoft, I believe, who will be talking about why we should trust hardware and firmware in our stacks. Have I gotten to all the topics people expected to see today? Anything that has been missed on the agenda? All right, well, with that, we will take a very quick look at roll call. We do not have any voting topics today, and we always try to minimize voting.
Hey, James, sorry. Took me a long time to find my mute button. If there's a minute at the end, and this is optional, I can just do a lightning quick update on that ISO standard that I'm going to try and keep on our radar a little bit. Had a chance to talk to Jory, and just a quick update.
Perfect. Got you slotted in.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I was a little late joining because I was talking to Jory.
No, that's cool. So we'll probably do that after the NARC's update. Thank you. So at any rate, Alec has joined us from Microsoft. If I kind of start at the top here, do we have Nathaniel or David? Nope. I see you on there, Paul. Thanks for joining. Catherine, thanks for joining. Always a bad time for Howard. I am here. Henry or Kevin? Okay, I don't see Meta today. Thanks again, Alec. Fritz sent his apologies ahead of time that he's got a conflict. Yash has had an emergency arise, so thoughts with Yash this morning. And then Mingshen or Dale. Okay, no TikTok this morning. And Bob, thanks for joining us from Shielded Technologies. All right. If you haven't had a chance to introduce yourself to the community before, this is the time that we set aside to do that. So everybody feels welcome here. Just feel free to pop off of mute and let us know how you like to be addressed and where you're joining from and your interest in the fantastic technology called confidential computing.
Hey guys, I'll just hop straight in and introduce myself as Phil Bladen. He, him, pronouns fine. And I'm from Amoda Design, which is a technology consultancy based in Sheffield in England. And we're doing a lot of research at the moment into AI security and developing hardware for running trusted AI training. And so obviously very interested in confidential computing there and how we can extend it with our own hardware developments.
Very cool. Thanks for joining. Certainly a topical area. All right. And I think everybody else has had an opportunity to introduce themselves in the past, but if I've made a mistake on that, feel free to interrupt me at any time. All right, last time we did a little bit of heads up on the governing board meeting and talked about the where we are with the mentorships. at a checkpoint for that, and looking for presentations from the mentees in future meetings. And then we had the annual updates for Oaklam and Verti. And then we finalized our discussions on the workload identity SIG, the trustworthy workload identity SIG. And we took that to a GitHub, not really a GitHub issue, but we took that to a PR and approved that asynchronously. That is now kicked off. We have, I guess I could have put that in the announcements. So that's officially kicked off now. And there is a mail list, there is a Slack. I accidentally created a second Slack, which we've since archived. And things look like they're going full steam on that.
I'll just add, please attend our meetings on Tuesdays. We need participation. And we now have our charter, we have our requirements. Next is we need to work out the reference architecture. So please attend.
Definitely. And I think we heard from pretty much all of the Premier members who are represented here that they intended to participate. So great if we can see the follow through on that. Catherine?
So I have to apologize. I will not be able to make the Tuesday meeting, unfortunately, due to a conflict. Is it okay if I volunteer a member from Google to attend that meeting on behalf?
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't have to be one of us. It's anybody in your companies that have an interest or expertise with workload identity.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Good question.
Alec, we have not heard anyone from Microsoft in those meetings. So can you please find someone?
Yeah, I've been trying to find someone to participate. There's a lot of whimsy enthusiasts here, and so trying to figure out how to do that. Here's what I'll do. I'll attend as a non-attestation SIG member and represent from that perspective.
Well, at OC3 last week, there was a guy from Microsoft who seemed pretty enthusiastic about confidential computing. His name was Mark Rusinovich. Let's see if he's available.
Rings a bell.
Get someone who's actually got some power in the organization involved. There's no point in going with small players, really, is there?
Yeah, I've been trying, Mike, but I think you guys are going to have to settle for a small player in this case. Anyway.
All right. So moving things along here, we had a board meeting in between this meeting and our previous TAC meeting. I don't recall any big decisions being made there, but we gave the updates and they were appreciated on what was happening with the TWI SIG and the other things we have going on. And something that I learned was that Outreach is working on a member badge. So that's not necessarily a technical topic, but for each of the companies here who are member companies, there's a badge that's in the works, so you can kind of show off that you are a member company of the consortium. And we also had OC3 last week, which we just mentioned. I don't think we've got time in today's agenda, but it would be great if in the next meeting somebody wanted to give a recap of points that they thought were particularly interesting, and we can kind of have an open discussion on things that people found from that conference. Is there anybody who would like to volunteer?
I can talk a little bit to it. So I attended in person and also spoke. So the first couple of hours was in German only, and it turns out, well, I wasn't expecting my German to be good enough to cope with it, but it also turns out that neither the translation services I had on my tablet and phone were able to keep up. So I did other work during that time. With about 200 people in person for at least part of it. And I hear around 700 people online. The outreach committee is hoping to get exact figures. Hybrid is difficult. Sorry,
sorry. That's great if you want to give a recap. If you want to do that for next time, that.
Oh, for next time. Sorry, I should be paying more attention. Yes. Okay. That's okay. I'll shut up. Carry on.
All right. Any other announcements, news in the consortium people are aware of that we don't have captured here? All right. Well, we will turn the floor over to NARCS and Richard Zach. I will stop sharing to give you, I don't know if you have things that you want to show, you're not obligated to, but the floor is yours for however you would like to use it.
Sure. I'm going to keep this short. I haven't had much in the terms of updates. You know, as a reminder, it's been basically me as a one-man band, trying to keep the lights on. I've had some difficulties with some. I've been trying to do some dependency updates, and I've kind of run into some issues where some of the dependencies have changed drastically, and some of my knowledge of NARCs in the innermost guts is limited, and I've been unable to kind of reconcile that. So not good news. Also, with my company, there was some interest in confidential computing, and I've continued to talk about NARCs and confidential computing to various people internally to kind of get some interest. And I've had a lot of people have a lot of interest, but it's been always slow to get beyond the interest. But I was hoping that I could try to get my company interested in being a sponsor, or at least get involved with some of the development of NARCs. As far as good news, I've been working with a fellow that Mike put me in touch with at Rhombus Tech. This is over a year ago. But I'm going to share a blog post in the chat. This is a Web3 company, and they have NARCs running in production to handle some of their whatever Web3 stuff they're doing. I don't fully understand it, but they're decentralized. I'm just going to shut up. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know Web3. But I did spend some time with him to help him try to figure out some of like where he was missing the gaps in knowledge of confidential computing and NARCs, and to help him get started. He did say that now that they have it running, that they think that they can kind of help with some of the development of NARCs a little bit. So I'm hoping that him and I, or me and one other person over there, can at least overcome some of the issues that I was experiencing. Additionally, I've been doing some changes to the CI to kind of pull out some of the NICs components that were added, because that stuff has been breaking. The code is still fine, but the NICs broke, so it made it look like with GitHub Actions that the NARCs project doesn't work, and I didn't want it to have that negative outlook. So I didn't remove the NICs functionality. I just took it out of the CI components for the moment. And then finally, last time I spoke about how I wanted to set up a public steward for people to use. And I wanted to go with Nathaniel's route that he had suggested of using an HSM and actually set up an NARCs proper certificate authority. So I bought an HSM. It's the NitroKey USB HSM. And I've been trying to figure out how to actually use it properly. So I don't have it working yet, but I have the hardware at least, and it's on the to-do list. So I think it'd be pretty exciting, and looking forward to that. But other than that, excuse me, that's what I have for NARCs.
Okay, cool. So that NitroKey USB HSM, is that Nitro like the Amazon Nitro, or is that unrelated?
No, it's a German company. They're kind of like Yubico that make YubiKeys. They make Nitro keys that have different. Basically, it's the same kind of thing. The FIDO, UTF, UFT, or whatever it's called. But they have a USB HSM. It was $100. So I'm going to play with that and figure out how to use it properly and get set up with an NARCS CA. And then if that goes well, then I might actually get a real deal HSM if it makes sense to do so. But yeah, I personally don't know anything about HSMs other than at a high level, so it's something that I'm excited to look at and learn more about. But again, it is just me, and I have two jobs to do before the confidential computing stuff kind of comes into play. So I work my day job at Booz Allen, and then I work part-time as a adjunct faculty at University of Maryland, teaching students. So time is limited, but I do make time for NARCS, of course.
That's great that you're able to make time for Anarchs with basically 2 jobs there on top of that. So I'm going to open it up to the rest of the audience, TAC members and everyone. I've put in the chat the normal review points that we like to check in on. So ask questions if you want answers for those things, or if you have other curiosities of the things that that Richard brought up. Go ahead, Alec.
Hey, Richard. First, thanks for the update, and I feel you, man. You're burning the candle at both ends. Thanks for the teaching job, by the way. Those are awesome. Had a chance to address some students yesterday myself, and that's the favorite part of my week. Did you send Dan an invoice for your HSM? Because I think the CCC has budget for those kinds of expenditures. You should send him an invoice. Make sure you put some markup on there for the research you had to do to arrive at which piece to buy.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I figured I wasn't really going to ask for much. Also, I'm partially thinking to I have the Profian machines that I've turned off because electric power bill. But if I could get some of the development going again, then I was thinking that instead maybe I would ask for put like a power meter on those things and see if I could get some reimbursement for the electric bill. And I was going to have a conversation with Equinix. They seemed interested to kind of support at least some CI runners. That they said that they were going to have an API so that at least it would take a long time, but at least it would work, where the GitHub runner could talk to NARC, could talk to Equinix, start up a CI job, run on actual hardware, and then shut down. And then that seems to have petered off. And then they also announced that they were getting rid of their bare metal instances. So yeah, so I have the hardware, it's working, but it's currently off. Oh, and actually one more thing for the update, I forgot. I did work last summer after the last update with Thomas. I'm drawing a blank on his last name, who helped with some of the updates for the AMD SEV to keep the NARCS code up to date with the latest from the AMD kernel side.
Basadi?
Very cool.
No. His name is Freak X Thomas. Hold on, give me a sec. Thomas Dorman. Thomas Dorman.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah, he's been a. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Carry on, Richard. Didn't mean to
I
stop.
was just saying he's been a contributor to NARCS kind of off and on.
Yeah.
He won. He did like a really nice talk with us at DEF CON one year where we talked about a vulnerability that he had discovered.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you for keeping the dream alive. I really appreciate it.
I'm doing my best. I feel like I'm not doing
it's-
well enough, but I'm
No,
trying.
doing anything is great, and particularly given that you're trying to hold down 15 other jobs as well. It's not easy. I absolutely get that. There was some, we had thought about taking it to ARM CCA realms as well. I guess there's been no movement on that, and I wondered if anyone from the ARM ecosystem is on the call. I'm not sure they are. Oh yeah, Paul. Wonder if there's any interest in working on that.
Hi, Mike. Yeah, certainly. Would be interested. I've not looked at NARCs or tracked NARCs for some time. But yeah,
Neither have I particularly, honestly. Although I was one of the co-founders, so I think that unless there are resources that ARM wanted to put towards it, Richard's not going to have the time to extend in that direction on his own, would be my suspicion, right, Richard? He's nodding along.
Correct.
But it sounds like if there are people who are interested in it, then there might be opportunities there. But yeah, Richard, thank you very much indeed. Really pleased to see that keeping it going. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's a pretty awesome project, and it was quite sad when
Yes.
I would love to work with someone at ARM to get CCA support in. Here, I'll just put my email in the chat. I don't have people's contact information, but Paul, since you also mentioned the Nitro key,
yes,
it might be interesting to chat with you at some point to learn a bit
yeah,
more. But
sure,
anyway,
yes, yeah, more than happy to have a conversation. The Nitro key is yeah, can be a bit idiosyncratic, and but yeah, I've got some experience of prodding those things into action. So it's a few years ago, so I might have to page things back in, but I'm more than happy to try to help if I can. And yeah, with regards to ARM CCA, we can certainly have a conversation.
cool. Yeah, if you could send me a message, I drop my email address in the chat.
Sure.
Cool. Thanks.
You also mentioned that you have conversations with people who have interest, or you would like to have conversations with people who have interest. Part of what we want to be able to facilitate as a TAC is assistance wherever we can. So feel free to reach out to any of us if you think we might be able to help with any of the conversations that you had planned. I don't kind of replay what you said back in my head here, but I don't remember the specific companies. But if there's particular ones that people heard that they've got contacts in that might be able to help out with Richard, please step forward with that.
Yeah, these people are folks internal to Booz Allen, working on whatever, generally government contracts. But I've been trying to make some inroads to some of our commercial side, so that's all legwork that I have to do. Unless, of course, anyone here knows people at Booz Allen, which would love to hear some of those names if that is the case. But yeah, no, that's something I've been gradually working on.
Thought I'd take a quick moment to offer to you and also anybody else who's interested. I have 10 years of confidential computing and Web3 experience, so that's a strong area for me. So
Yeah,
happy
very
to
cool.
help with any evaluations there.
Well, that might be a good segue.
I'm sorry, the audio is very choppy all of a sudden.
Way to for the benefit of you or for
Yeah, really bad audio. Dan, don't know what's going on.
It's not only the audio, it seems like your connection is lagging, Dan.
You've gone away. Hopefully. Oh no, are you there, Dan?
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm just going to try to change my network.
Working great.
Yeah, I'm on my company's VPN, so I'm going to try to pop off. That'll probably disconnect me for a minute. If somebody could explain the project liaison role while I'm doing that, that would be great. are you able to hear me?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Did anybody explain the project liaison role? No. Okay. Let me share that back up. Okay, so each TAC member is intended to buddy up with a project or a working group. And so Bob, you currently don't have one of these buddy roles yet. There are 4 projects that don't yet have buddies. Richard is here, of course, for NARCs. There's also Gramming, Keystone, and Oakland that are uncovered. And you don't have to respond on the spot here, but if you would like to cover NARCs, that's we just heard a variety of needs from Richard.
I'll do a little more digging. See what's appropriate.
Okay. If somebody could drop a link in the chat for that gives a little bit more description, and that way Bob can read that. A lot of this is captured in our governance repo. So if you haven't had a chance to peruse that, it's got it's intended to have everything that we typically do. There's probably still some tribal knowledge that's not captured there. All right, any last questions for Richard? All right, well, thank you very much for continuing to carry the torch there, Richard, and for preparing the update for
Thank
NARCs.
you very much for
Yeah.
having me. And let's keep in touch. And I'm also on the Slack, so I don't say much, but I see your messages.
Oh, very cool. And don't forget to send us the bills, because as a consortium project, you are welcome to use that funding. It goes unspent otherwise, so you won't be hurting anybody.
Okay, cool. Well, then, thank you very much, and I'll be in touch.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Oh, Nicholas, you had a question, comment?
Yeah, just for my education, I was just curious, if I take something like confidential containers in the CNCF, is there a reason why a project like that is not on this table? Just out of curiosity.
Yes, there is, because it's part of the CNCF. So they chose, which is fine, because they're container based, to join the CNCF rather than the CCC. So we don't have a huge amount to do with them. I know there are people here who work on it as well, but that's the reason it's not there.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
No problem.
Yeah, so we actually have a couple touch points. So there's the VerTE project in the CCC, and that provides some dependencies for the COCO project and CNCF. And we've got people that sit in both communities. All right, I just kind of popped this up here as a reminder of the different things that projects benefit from as part of being in the consortium. And thanks to Alec for the reminder that the infrastructure money is available. And just looking at where we are here. So we can switch forward now to the ISO discussion. I didn't put any material here for you, Alec, but I could also probably grab the list discussion on that, if that helps.
No, that's okay. It's a lightning quick update. Just wanted to alert the TAC that there was a project proposal at the ISO to put together a document with confidential computing definitions. It's basically I think I sent some email around just to refresh folks that the document is titled Definitions or an Introduction to Confidential Computing. I'm trying to, the document, by the way, that I got a draft, but I'm unable to circulate the draft because of copyright. And I certainly don't want to do anything in violation of an ISO copyright if we're then going to try and reach out and be friends with them. So hope the committee can wait for a little while until we have permission to redistribute the draft. What I'd like to do is establish a liaison, and there's a very formal process for establishing a liaison between an organization and the International Standards Organization. I'm trying to make it so that either the Linux Foundation or the Joint Standards Foundation, which is part of the Linux Foundation, or the Confidential Computing Consortium, which is another legal entity, is the correct one to establish the liaison. I'm getting some advice from the Linux Foundation, Jory. She understands all of the legal stuff. I do not. So I met with her, kind of laid out for her what our intent is as the Confidential Computing Technical Advisory Committee. She's going to talk to the folks, the legal folks within the Linux Foundation, and come back and advise us on what's the proper way to engage with the ISO. And there's a lot of options. One is we could author a document, for example, a white paper, and then submit it to the ISO and ask for that to be approved as an ISO standard. Another is for us to work with a working group like the one that's already established and try and influence them. Reading the document, they're using definitions that I think are not exactly aligned with confidential computing standards. They've also cited a lot of the work in our white papers, which is great, but some of those documents are very SGX centered, and so the definitions that they came up with are very SGX centered, and I wanted to expand them to include TDX and to include other confidential computing approaches by other silicon vendors. You know, AMD and certainly ARM. So all of that is going on. That's about all I have. Mike, when I spoke to Jory this morning, I kind of volunteered you as being willing to be the liaison representative. I said that either one of us might work, but that you as the executive director might be a better fit. So we need to, you and I and she need to sync on that. So once we have a plan, I was hoping we could do a three-way call and sort of figure that out. And that's where I'm at. So that was a little bit of a ramble. Hopefully it was a good update. Don't know enough yet to give any sort of conclusive information, but I wanted to keep the TAC informed on where we are at this particular point in time, even if it's a little nebulous still.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm not sure I will be the right person, but we can certainly talk. So that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and in fact, Alec, I would have a mild preference for keeping on the plan with you as the liaison, mostly based on we have a finite amount of Mike's time, whereas we have an infinite amount of your time.
Got it. Got it. Absolutely. And I do have infinite time. That's one of my secret powers. So I didn't realize.
Yeah, no, we noticed.
Yeah, okay. I didn't realize you'd noticed. Okay, cool. We'll try and keep it between us though, Dan. Okay, I don't want everybody to know.
I won't mention a word.
And it certainly won't have been recorded, so that's fine.
All right, that's it.
Okay.
Thanks, Alex.
Well, we already kind of touched on the project liaisons, and we won't have Emily for another approximately 20 minutes, unless Emily snuck in. Paul?
Yes, thank you. Just before we leave the project liaisons topic, so speaking as the incoming project liaison for the Certifier Framework project, I was fortunate enough to be able to connect with that community for the first time last week, and they do have a request of me in my liaison role. So they're giving me some stuff to do, which is great. And I'm not quite sure how to proceed. So fundamentally, what they're requesting is funding for an internship opportunity. And they have a technical proposal. So there is a research student, I can't remember which university they are, Missouri, University of Missouri, who is keen to do some work on the Certifier Framework project under a funded mentorship, and they would like to apply for a grant from the CCC to fund that activity. And they have a technical proposal to some level, Obviously, I'm new to the Certifier Framework project, so I can't detail the technical proposal very well. But their ask of me is to effectively shepherd this student through the process of applying for the funding from the CCC. So that's not a process I'm actually familiar with. I just wanted to raise that I've been handed this.
Okay, that's great. I'm glad that they've got interest and they've got project and people picked out. So there's maybe too many words in this section of the governance repo. There's quite a bit of infrastructure here so that we could scale up across a lot of projects. I think it's probably a simpler process than might be apparent from taking a quick look at it. Yash has been owning this, and he's not here with us this morning, but he'd be able to inform you on that better than I could, or you could take a look through this material here.
I'm sorry, I missed the name there because I was putting something into the chat.
Yash, Yash, Yash Mankad.
Oh, Yash. Oh, yes, right. Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. So is that what I do then? I ask Yash about the details of the process.
That would probably be best. Rian also knows. Rian's at KubeCon right now,
KubeCon.
so also not
Okay.
with us today.
Okay.
And
in that case, that's cool. Yes, I can follow up with those individuals and get back to them.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
The answer is it should absolutely be doable.
fantastic. Yeah, so that's sort of a sampling, Bob, of the kind of thing. It's not a very frequent interaction that's intended for this liaison role, but kind of checking in maybe monthly or quarterly with a project, understanding where they're at, understanding what their needs are, and helping to connect them with the resources that they are due as a consortium project.
Okay, sounds good.
And I see that Emily Fox has joined us, and we are a little bit ahead of schedule in the agenda. So Emily, I don't know if you are prepared to jump into things now, but we would be ready for you if you are.
I am. Is it all right if I take over screen share?
That would be more than okay.
Awesome. All right.
So as Emily's getting set up here, Emily is the governing board representative for Red Hat and also a strong contributor in OpenSSF and the CNCF. And Emily will be talking to us today about the security baseline project that comes from the OpenSSF.
Yes. All right. Thanks so much for the lovely introduction, Dan. So like Dan said, I'm Emily Fox. I do a lot of stuff in open source. I'm one of your board members. You've probably seen
Emily?
me. Yes.
We see your presenter view and not your presented screen.
Thank you. Stand by. Let's see if I can get this sorted. Fun. My presenter stuff is not working today. How's that?
Much better.
Love it when the windows move around on me. Okay. So I'll just jump right in then. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different things today, what the OpenSSF's Auspice baselines actually are, why we made them, what specifically it is, what it includes within it, as well as a few other fun things and where we're looking to get feedback and input from everyone and what's coming next. So we've had a lot of industry and regulatory frameworks that have been around for a long period of time. Those are primarily focused on commercial activities, software manufacturers, vendors, and even in some cases end users that are required to comply with certain cybersecurity frameworks and things like that. A few years ago, there was an effort in OpenSSF to kind of start introducing more supply chain security frameworks to guide open source projects and consumers of open source projects in understanding software supply chain security. So there's SALSA, there's the NIST CSF, there's a lot of different things, but in today's day and age, we're starting to see a lot more global cybersecurity legislation. It's growing, it's expanding. People are paying more attention to where they're getting their technologies, what the security posture of those technologies are, and whether or not that's introducing additional risk. But the problem is that we lack a mechanism that translates between all of these different frameworks into something that's the lowest common denominator that's accessible for open source to be able to achieve, something that's very simple, very basic, and most commonly occurring across all security criteria and controls and frameworks in a language and in a mechanism that open source contributors, maintainers, and community members can easily understand, rapidly implement, and then move on to doing the things that they want to continue to do, which is feature development and unfortunately bug fixes in a lot of different cases. But the existing frameworks don't do this. With new legislation coming, we may like it or not to even want to think about it, but the reality is that it's still going to continue to happen, and it will have a longer term impact on open source developers and projects. We see this today with many organizations issuing demands to open source projects to do certain security practices or activities, and they're not met with much success. The existing frameworks are based on two faulted assumptions when they apply to open source. There's a lot more, but the two biggest ones are, the reality is that security engineers don't exist in every single open source project to read, interpret, and apply frameworks and controls that were written by compliance organizations and individuals that are more risk focused. It's a different kind of skill set. And indeed, many of the frameworks have criteria that is entirely out of scope of open source and were never designed to be universally applicable to something that such as a common good. Not every project also exists in GitHub or GitLab. So this is another challenge. So while a lot of new open source style frameworks are designed for projects that exist on GitHub or GitLab, the fundamental reality is that that single maintainer in Nebraska is probably not even there. They might be maintaining their code base over an email list or locally on their own file system. Open source is older than both of these technologies, GitHub and GitLab, and many critical and key projects still exist outside of both and don't have any plans to migrate, which is totally fine. That's their prerogative. The other aspect of all of this is that open source is open and transparent. You literally get what you see, but you can't see something that isn't there. And in the absence of information, adopters in open source projects can't establish trust or understanding in what security primitives a project has applied to protect themselves as well as their users, both in the organization and setup of their repositories, as well as the design constructs inherent within the project itself. It's similar to, how do you know if you ran a test and it passed or failed if there's no evidence at all that it was run or how extensive that test was in the course of its execution? A lot of people that typically write criteria and controls are not open source developers, so they don't understand a lot of the cultural aspects and the maintenance frameworks that we commonly take for granted within our communities. These are professional security and compliance engineers who focus exclusively on risk. The skill sets are different. The act of writing criteria is separate and distinct from how an individual or an organization could potentially implement it. The real need is in the implementation, and ensuring that developers of open source projects can independently understand without relying on a security engineer to be available is super critical for their ability to actually introduce security changes to their projects for the benefit of themselves as well as their adopters. So this is what we made. It's the Open Source Project Security Baseline, or OSPAS. It's a collection of security criteria that is that common denominator across a lot of frameworks, rewritten in a way that is easily understandable to provide help and guidance for projects to achieve the absolute basics of security. It was created by a group of open source contributors with a security tendency that allows us to bring in a diverse array of experiences across multiple open source groups, foundations, and incorporates feedback from projects that we've already tested this with so that they understand how the criteria could potentially be applied from the baseline, so we can also iteratively improve upon the work that we've just started. So we released this in February of 2025. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback. There's a blog post about it already, and our repo link is on the slide. There's about 40 requirements across 3 levels that cover 8 basic areas of cyber and application security practices. The most common of them being access control. That's pretty much everywhere. Build and release. If you're doing anything with software, we hope you're doing something with building and releasing it. Documentation, which is what a lot of organizations, contributors, and even other maintainers go to get a comprehensive understanding of the project. Governance, how are you operating? Any legal aspects associated with the project to ensure that your contributors are in fact authorized to contribute to the project with the content that they are providing in those PRs. The quality of the project itself from a security perspective, whether or not they've done their own self-assessment to understand what their posture is, and probably the most important for many individuals is, do they do vulnerability management and what is their associated policies? Those 8 categories of criteria in the baseline are based off of existing frameworks and standards. They cover a lot of the top level items that every open source project should be considering at different stages of their life cycle. Who and what has access to make changes to their code base, to their project configuration? What information does a project actually want to make available publicly about how it works? What restrictions do they want to have in place on their code when it comes to either direct merges or even just conducting PR reviews? How many do they want to have? How do they actually want to run the project? Many maintainers of open source projects don't think about this, so we're trying to introduce those concepts early so they can start thinking about it ahead of time, form some opinions, and get some lightweight governance in place. How do they want to get their project into the hands of adopters? This is also another thing that many maintainers don't think about, especially from a security perspective, because adopters do care about security. How good should the project be? What is their kind of appetite for improving security? And it's okay that some projects want to go above and beyond and achieve all the things. In other cases, projects just want to do what they need to do to make adoption easier and allow them to get the most amount of adopters to the project and potential contributors. So there might be a minimum bar for them to achieve security outcomes, especially given they may only have 1 or 2 maintainers that are capable of implementing and enforcing a lot of those security criteria. And then how are they making things better or worse for the project and adopters, and what happens when something goes sideways? How do they deal with it, such as when a 0-day is dropped on the project? How quickly can they fix? How quickly can they ascertain the relevance of the vulnerability to the project, whether or not they're impacted, if it's actually on them to fix? How do they fix it? And then how do they cut that release and then notify all of their adopters without revealing any sensitive information? The best part about a lot of these is that they're based on international standards and security frameworks, not anything unique or specific to one country. Any project that implements a level of the baseline allows them to help address upcoming legislation and adopters that are demanding information from the project. And instead of responding to those requests onesie, twosie, we've collected the criteria in a way that allows the project to take a focused effort to document and to express their conformance with this so that they can just point those adopters to that information instead of constantly being pinged and constantly copying, pasting responses back and forth. It also allows them to express how they're going to achieve security for their project when they don't use GitHub or GitLab. The criteria are outcome-oriented. That allows for providing projects with flexibility in their implementation. Because no 2 open source projects are the same, we want to make sure that everybody has options that are unique to their governance, their operations, their code base in a way that makes sense. We also want to ensure that projects can increase the information available to adopters and other open source projects, about the security primitives and principles that have been applied and by its maintainers that provides a mechanism of building trust and understanding within the software itself. And finally, providing understandable explanations and context to developers, contributors, and maintainers as to why a security control should be applied, what the benefit is to them, and what it specifically protects the project against. And because these criteria are from international frameworks and standards, adopters of projects can map and understand what controls have been met by the project already in a transparent way and where they have responsibilities and work to do. Now, just because we've got the mapping doesn't mean that you can take it at face value. Every adopter needs to understand and conduct their own due diligence for open source projects that they choose to adopt and create critical dependencies on in order to understand precisely how the project is implementing a baseline criterion and if it is satisfactory to the adopter's specific needs, compliance obligations, and risk tolerances. If it isn't, it means that the adopter has a responsibility to do that for themselves and not impose those requirements on open source. It does not mean that the adopter can demand the project to implement a specific criterion in a specific way. There are a lot of different ways that you can meet the criteria in the auspice baselines, either from level 1 all the way up to level 3, and the specifics are entirely dependent on the type of project, code, location, and other decisions that are made by maintainers. This is an example of one of the controls that you'll see on the baseline site. It also provides you the title of the criteria, a description, and any recommendations we have on how you could potentially implement it. We also identify the ideal maturity level of the project it is intended for, along with those mappings. And for spreadsheet lovers, we even have a link to all the controls and mappings down at the bottom of this slide. So there's 3 levels that I had mentioned previously. Level 1, you can think about it as the universal security floor. We expect all open source projects to be able to achieve this. While if you're looking at 20 controls seems like a lot, you're probably already actually doing a lot of these things if you're on GitHub or GitLab. And if you're not, you've probably been around long enough that you have some semblance of these controls already being met. You just might need to formally document it. For projects that are already in foundations, like the Confidential Computing Consortium, the level 1 baseline we're recommending as the first set of criteria for maturing projects or even accepting them into the foundation. It is ideal for projects that have one maintainer. That's why we've designed it to be so achievable. Level 2, there's an additional 18 controls. These are basically things that are excellent for projects that are 2 to 6 maintainers. It's slightly more work than the level 1, but we think it's still very achievable. And then level 3, this is probably it is the highest level that we have. There's an additional 9 security controls, and these are for projects that are large scale, very robust, highly mature. In some foundations, we call them graduated. This is something that we want to see those highly mature projects achieve, and indeed, many of them probably already have this in place, especially if they have really strong, robust security practices and even an incident response or a vulnerability management team or group associated with them. One of the really great things about the auspice baseline is that we're already working towards aligning several existing and new open SSF tools towards these baseline criteria so that we can provide tooling and support to projects in both achieving the baseline as well as expressing that they've met the specific criteria for the level that they choose to define. We're using lessons and learnings from creation of these past tools, feedback on them even still today, framework challenges that other projects have had in implementing various security frameworks, and other activities within the security ecosystem that make baseline more approachable. We also are looking at defining hooks and interfaces to improve the accuracy, usability, and capacity of the tools for projects to be able to take advantage of in achieving auspice baseline level 1, 2, or 3. One of the future things that we're striving towards as part of this is continued improvements associated with the references to industry framework specs and standards, creation of the baseline criteria or the catalog as we call it, onboarding through the best practices badging program, and then eventually working towards automated evaluation through scorecards. A lot of project feedback that we've gotten to date is that they don't like the concept of scoring. So we're engaged in active conversations within OpenSSF on how do we improve that experience without shaming projects that are still working towards things, because scorecard was designed for projects in GitHub and GitLab. And like I said, not every project is there. We're also looking at security insights file extension to provide machine readable attestations of what the project has actually done to date, and leveraging Minder for doing policy-based decisions and enforcement in their GitHub repos associated with their implementation of those controls. And if you're a Linux Foundation project, you have access to the LFX dashboard. So we're looking at ways in which we can pull both the automated evaluation, the attestations, and any claims that a project makes on the repository into a dashboard so that they can self-service and see how they're achieving that, what they've done. So we have a lot of work still ahead of us. We're constantly changing some of our recommendations. We're looking at adding new templates and guides and additional information based off of feedback from projects that are implementing these. We're looking at adding those automations to ease the adoption of the baseline criteria for projects, trying to make it as simple and easy as possible so project maintainers don't have to spend any more time on this than they absolutely want to. We're looking at also developing evidence and attestation publications so that adopters can leverage material content produced by these projects to assist them in their own compliance needs. So if your organization is in scope for CRA, paying attention to what's going on in the baseline space in your upstream project's adoption is probably going to be to your benefit. And like I said, we're looking at leveraging the LFX dashboard for a single pane of glass view across all the projects, and then defining a reference architecture that shows end-to-end how the baseline works in conjunction with other components and technologies that we're making available through the ecosystem. So our call to action for you all is take a look at the baselines. Let us know how you feel about them, whether or not they're realistically achievable or not. If there's any clarity that we can provide, we're looking for active feedback. These kinds of criteria are only useful if they work for the more than 80% of open source projects that exist out there. So if you have comments and suggestions, you can send them directly to me. You can jump into the OpenSSF Slack and post them there, or you can check out the GitHub repo and file issues, and we'll get back to you that way. You can also contribute any suggested changes directly and include and also any automation and tooling that you've been working on in the background to try to solve some of these problems on your own or independently. And last but not least, we always want to see projects implementing the baselines. Let us know through the course of your experience and implementation if you got stuck on something or if you figured out a different way of implementing it or achieving the same outcome with an alternative kind of methodology. We're always looking for other ways and understanding and how projects can potentially achieve these so that we can share and disseminate that information to other projects. Okay, that's everything for me. Any questions?
Good job. Nice.
Yes,
so to be clear, I'm very strongly in favor of getting all of the projects which are doing anything in the CCC at least baseline level 1. If anyone wants to go for 2 or 3, that's even better. But I think it would be really good to have us as a. I should also be clear that the LF is going to be pushing all projects within the LF umbrella to adopt this, but we could be early adopters, and that would be a good thing.
I have a bag of questions, but I want to make sure that we get some questions from people like Alec, who's just raised his virtual hand.
I went first last time, Dan. Let me cede the floor to you first, and once your bag is empty, I have a few in a bag of my own. I'll keep
Okay.
those that I'm next in line.
Okay, as you wish. So, Emily, you had like 2 slides on this question, but I still haven't quite grokked it. For CCC projects, we have strongly recommended that all of our projects adopt the best practices badge. And we were kind of in the process of feeling out what we would do for scorecards adoption. So with baseline, how would you position that versus the best practices badge for the first question?
So there are similarities, but there's still a lot of differences. So the auspice baseline has some aspects of the best practices badge. So if you're going down the path of having projects achieve passing level criteria for OpenSSF best practices, that's admirable. And you'll get a lot of those controls implemented with auspice baseline as well. But the baseline has a much more expansive security focus, where the best practices badging only has like 1 or 2 sections that are focused on security. So you can think about it as the best practices badging on how to get your ducks in order for creating an open source software project. And the auspice baseline is the next step for you to achieve in instrumenting security within your project, both from a GitHub configuration or your source code repository configuration perspective, as well as the design considerations for security outcomes within your project. Scorecard is also slightly different in that it does have more of a security focus, but again, it was designed assuming that most projects are in GitHub and GitLab and doing things a very specific way. So because the auspice program or auspice baselines allows flexibility in how you're doing implementation, you would show up on scorecards as missing a score or being downgraded in score because you're not doing it in the way that they expect you to. So that's where we're having conversations with the OpenSSF TAC and scorecards on how do we adjust and shift scorecards more to the benefit beyond just GitHub and GitLab based projects. Did that answer your question?
Yes. So, well, let me see if it did. So it sounds like if we're on track with the best practices badge for our projects, that's a good stepping stone to get to baseline level 1.
Mm-hmm. And you should be
And so
able to do them both at the same time. Yeah.
And do them at the same time, in fact. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I believe the baselines, I'd have to double check the specifics, but I think we do have mapping to some of the best practices badging. And if we don't, I will take that action back to the team to provide better clarity between them. We also have FAQs on our site as well that answer some of these common questions.
Okay. Alec, I greatly exaggerated the number of questions I had.
That was a small bag, Dan. I just have I have to note that. Emily, thanks for the great presentation. This was super useful, and I've been reading along on baseline.openssf.org, and I think those are great standards. So let's say I'm a convert now. You have been preaching the gospel of auspice, and I am a convert. How do I evangelize to folks within my company that maybe have some CCC projects that need to do this? Would I and 2 parts. One is I'm looking at these and I'm thinking, level 1, I am not part of the build team, so I don't have direct view into whether or not they meet these projects, but just reading through them, I think they make sense, right? Any OpenVMM, for example, which is a pretty modern project, they've just open sourced it. I feel pretty sure that they're going to meet these levels, some of them at least. So how can I get the team to try and work with this, and how can they then show that they are auspice compliant? So we've got a badge for our own, Linux Foundation. How can they show that they're auspice compliant?
So as far as kind of starting down the path, going through the baselines is the first thing, and thinking about it more as, unfortunately, using the term checklist, but to see which things you've already done. The next step as far as the documentation goes, for right now, while we're working through what the security insights file extension would look like, I think there's an active PR if it hasn't already been merged on how to do this. Security insights would probably be the next best place to capture that you are implementing any of these. You can also go a much simpler path and just create a doc on your GitHub repo or in your source code repo or even your project web pages that says, here's the auspice level that we're achieving and how we're planning on achieving it. So there's a few different options. We're still working out the mechanics of how do we do the automation portion, the detection, and how do we make this simpler in a in a consistent format for projects. So monitor our repo is unfortunately the best answer I have in moving forward, but you can get started by taking a look at those, because there will eventually come a time that as long as you've got them documented, converting to a security insights file and then picking up something like Minder and the scorecards work is going to be fairly straightforward. It's just a matter of making sure all of the hard work you've already put in is showing up correctly in the places that it needs to. So I apologize, I don't have a better answer. We're still figuring it out. This is still in flight and brand new, but we would like to understand any of your projects' experience in going through this and seeing how we can make improvements to reduce the burden on them and conducting these kinds of activities.
Great answer. Pro tip, never make a public apology. So there was no need for that. This is awesome work, and it's in great shape already. So I think what I'm hearing is I tell the project maintainer that they simply need to go to this website and then add that SIF file to our repo. And since it's in GitHub already, I suspect that we get at least the top level for free, and maybe the top 2 levels for free. And I'm reading this as a little bit of a novice. If that's true, then maybe we can sort of work with you to kind of grease the skids a little bit for some of the other CCC projects. So
yeah.
But thanks for doing this, and our project Open VMM is right now on pause, but it will become off pause here pretty soon, and we'll reach out to you and try and get this going. It seems like it just makes really good sense.
That's what I want to hear. Anything that makes good sense is sense worth pursuing.
Yeah, I would love some unification of the best practices badge and auspice.
You're not the only one.
Okay. Not sure if that's a premature reaction to have, but for projects to go, we've asked the projects to go get this badge, and they're going to have this badge on their readmes, and then go get this other thing. Was it another badge? How is it different? So I can imagine other people having the same sort of questions that I had.
Yep. And I will take that back to the team and make sure that that's one of our priority focuses moving forward, is getting that reconciliation, because I do know the best practices badging, especially at passing criteria, is a requirement for many LF Foundation projects.
So maybe I'll actually just dig in a little bit deeper on what Alec was asking. So the security insights, that is not a feature of, was it of GitHub?
Correct. So the security insights file is something that was created by OpenSSF as an interim mechanism to allow projects to express how they are implementing security mechanisms within the project. I want to say it's about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years old tops, and we're constantly working on refining it. We wanted to avoid any potential confusion that projects might have in their security MD file, which is where most of their vulnerability and incident reporting information goes, to capture more of the nuanced aspects of how they're implementing security within their GitHub project. So what we're looking to do is actually expand that even further. It started with a limited set of kind of security focus areas and security insights, and now we actually want to formalize that more into auspice baseline controls as well. So there's more reconciliation coming to that.
Okay, so this would be an additional meta file that you would put into the repo.
Yes.
And I would see that out in the auspice repo right now.
There should be a PR. I'm actually looking for it right now, and maybe they closed it. Let me find the PR and the specifics on where the security insights file changes are, and I will share that back out to you directly.
Okay, that'd be great. Other questions from the community? We're about 15 minutes ahead of schedule for Brian's talk, so we have time if we have an efficient use for it, meaningful use for it, I should say.
I just sent email, or sorry, IM to Brian, so maybe he'll jump in a little bit early. I see he's available, but he's showing he's busy, so can't speak for that. It's only 15 minutes away.
I need to head off for just for a few minutes. I'll be back shortly, hopefully before Brian gets on. Or we could all just take a moment to breathe, take a bio break, get a cup of tea. No, I'll be back shortly.
Okay, well, if there's nothing else for Emily, Emily, thank you for joining us and ramping us up on baselines. And I guess we should probably take some time over the next couple weeks to review the content and then think about what we want to do from a policy aspect in the TAC here.
Make sure Brian has a meeting invite. Send that to him now. I think he does.
So one of the things that we always have in the backup for the agenda is our backlog of issues. We tend not to be too much GitHub oriented with our agendas and what we do, but we do have a few things out here we could go take a look at. So Mark had recently opened this issue just to update some definitions already from the charter. I don't think there's action for us right now on that one. We have checklists to onboard projects. We don't yet have a checklist to onboard SIGs. We don't think that's a super frequent thing, but we started to put that together for this most recent SIG. I think there's some open decisions for the SIG on whether they want to have a GitHub repo themselves or if they'll primarily work in something like Google Docs. When we formalize a document, we like to have it in version control somewhere though. And so it might be best that the SIG just grabs a directory within this governance repo. And then Rian has a couple other actions here for getting them listed on the website and some other logistical items. We just end up going in circles sometimes. We have an issue with a couple people's IDs for the code owners for the governance. We do not have Nathaniel on, but should you watch this recording, Nathaniel, we need you to accept the invitation. And then maybe as well this user, and I don't remember who Dirk No is in real life. I can't remember who that was. I also created a good first issue. So if you've got somebody in your company that's trying to ramp up, maybe shadowed you in your TAC role, this is a good first issue for them. Just simple updates into the way that we have things listed here. So we've got the repo to cover the project definitions and the SIG definitions. Each SIG should have a charter. They're not currently all listed in the overview and the README. Probably a chance that the project's README also doesn't have a complete mapping of these. Quick eyeball, it looks pretty good. And I see Brian is joining us, so I can probably stop tap dancing through the GitHub issues. That said, it's helpful to all of us for TAC members to go take a look at these issues periodically and try to clean them out. We've got some very old, very stale ones that can probably just be closed. But I'm going to turn things over to Brian here, who will talk about why should we trust computing hardware and firmware.
Yeah, first, let me just introduce Brian and say, hey, thanks for joining us, Brian. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk us through some of this stuff. The group that you're addressing here, we kind of, a lot of us are down in the hardware. Dan, I know, is super knowledgeable of the hardware, but a lot of us start at the application layer. And so we kind of take it for granted that if we're running in a confidential thing, a trusted execution environment, that everything below our application is just, super safe. And we don't really understand the number of devices and the amount of hardware and firmware that's beneath us. And so Brian does understand a lot about that. And so I'm super excited to hear you kind of introduce that topic and help us understand it better.
Yeah, thanks, Alec, and thanks, Dan, for the opportunity to come talk with you folks. Yeah, I'm a security architect. First, a little bit about me. I'm a security architect here in Azure, and I focus on our hardware security and making sure, a big part of that is our confidential compute architecture. So I work with Alec on that a lot. Other parts are just general supply chain, the kind of soup to nuts on the on hardware security. I get to talk with a lot of our customers too, and get some insights into what their concerns are, and take a step back and kind of look at the offerings that we have here in Azure, and whether we're really living up to their expectations, and where maybe we fall short and need to go and address that. So with that, I do have some slides to talk a little bit about how we kind of view hardware security and the journey that we're on. And I can just jump maybe straight into that. And then anytime you guys have questions, feel free to interrupt me. Let me see if I can get this screen shared. Let's go with this one, see if it works. All right. Assume you guys are seeing what I'm seeing.
Yep.
Yes.
Right. So journey to secure hardware infrastructure. Take a look at some components that are involved in secure devices. We have, of course, a hardware root of trust. I think it's a really critical part of confidential compute. It's a really critical part in just basic hardware security. We call it foundational when we look at our hardware security stack. This component is really foundational. It typically does, that first mutable code. It performs a digital signature verification on that. It starts the chain of attestation, and it also performs recovery, which is kind of like, we think about it as that protection, detection, and recovery flow, those three pillars. The root of trust is foundational in that. But as we go up the stack, it becomes more and more important in just that collection of hardware or firmware measurements and software measurements, and understanding what's actually running on any system. And then what should be running is kind of the next step down. And this is this reference integrity manifest that typically is provided along with hardware that says, hey, this is a valid list of ingredients or measurements that you should see on hardware that's up to date. And that's usually issued, again, by the hardware device manufacturer. And then this third bullet is one that we've identified as kind of a gap. It's always happened in the industry, but never in a very formal way. So it's a security conformance report. So you have hardware that can robustly provide measurements, of what it's running. And that's cryptographically provable. Is the hardware makes these claims. We know that this is what the hardware is actually running. We have a reference of measurements that come from the manufacturer. These are usually like digests, so a series of bytes. It's not very understandable to the human eye. Is like you're going to get a hash essentially. And then you're trying to decompose what that hash actually means and rebuild it from usually some binaries or some artifacts, some evidence that's provided. But actually understanding what's in that evidence is usually the step that's missing. And that's the security conformance report. So that just proves that some security due diligence has gone into the artifacts. So if we take a step back and say, practically, how would this work for a system that's booting? So you would have a hardware root of trust that measures the first firmware that's loaded into it, whether it's your BIOS or UEFI. You'll have a reference integrity manifest that comes from a system manufacturer that says, hey, you should be running this version, and here's some evidence and information about it. But when you say, hey, what am I actually trusting here? I can see what's running, but what is it? What does it mean? What security has gone into it? Have you ran static code analysis? Have you done a review? Have you done pen testing? What's actually gone into it? And that's the aspect that's usually missing. And that's where the security conformance report comes in. And interestingly, Azure and other hyperscalers would either do reviews like of code coming in. Like whenever we take third-party code or artifacts, we'd require security review, and we'd have some internal means to go and run these reviews ourselves. And then other times we would hire third-party security firms to help us review the mutable code that we're getting in, like this firmware code that we're getting in from third parties. And that didn't really scale well. We would find that there were some gaps in it where third-party firms who were providing it the feedback loop was incomplete, and we weren't learning and growing. So we took a step back, and we connected with some other cloud service providers that had the same. We found out they follow the same process. They have some internal capacity for performing reviews, and we'd all be actually performing the same review over the same artifacts. The hardware, I always say we all fish from the same pond, because the hardware industry isn't actually that big. And when we compare it to other industries, especially cloud hardware, there's like a limited number of like storage providers. You can probably count them on one hand, and then CPU providers and GPU providers, there's not that many. So we would end up performing the same work pretty much in doing these conformance reviews or security reviews. We'd end up doing the same work over and over, just in our separate silos. And then when we came together, we said, hey, can't we just align on the requirements that we do? And maybe, if you handle it, why not start to treat each other like these third-party review firms, that, hey, if you go review something, can you share the results with us, and vice versa. It's kind of how it started. And then that grew to be something we call OCP Safe. But we'll get into that. So taking the top thing down, the top thing from the list of components to secure devices, as I jump back, the first is this hardware root of trust. And we've also started to tackle that in the industry, in that we've seen a lot of fragmentation in hardware root of trust. In fact, we've been on this journey for hardware root of trust for a long time, almost as long as we've been on our confidential computing journey. We've been on this journey for hardware root of trust. Actually, probably before that. When we get into in 2016, we kind of came out and said, you know, hardware is not as secure as it should be. We want to, it's not as secure as it should be. We have this device, we call it our root of trust. We called it Cerberus at the time, and we launched that in the industry. And what it did was it made sure that firmware was digitally signed and fully attested, and it managed all these firmware components. And at the same time, other cloud service providers, they had similar architectures. There's not a whole lot of ways to, there was not a whole lot of ways to solve that problem. It was like, hey, if the hardware itself doesn't have these capabilities, you've got to bolt on, the side of it, a component that does, a little piece of hardware that does have these capabilities for, authenticating and measuring firmware. So that effort eventually led to us starting off an open source effort across companies that we call Calyptra. And that provides, that is a root of trust, actually a hardware root of trust. And that gets built into SoCs, and it's the thing that provides, these measurements and authentication and identity. And it's fully open source. So it's one of the desires we've seen from, talking with our customers is, when we get into the topic of trust, what you're actually trusting, some customers want to go deeper than, hey, with confidential compute, you don't have to necessarily trust us, the cloud service provider. You can trust the hardware. And then as we get into what does it mean to trust a hardware manufacturer, that story can start to come apart. When we drive more transparency into that and what it actually means, then it really starts to come together and resonate with those customers. People really want to know. They don't necessarily want to look themselves, but they want to have that option of transparency. And they, what we found is they really appreciate the ability to go look if they want to, and it gives them some assurance of the trustworthiness once they have that transparency. And then what this standardization around root of trust really enables is us to have some consistency in measurement, what's measured, how it's measured, and really simplify the stack. As we start to go up the stack, things get a little bit easier when the foundation that's underneath it is very consistent. So the reference integrity manifests, talk a little bit about those. You have at the bottom of this, you have these hardware rooted trusts that take measurements of the firmware that's actually running. We do that now in a consistent way with this Calyptra rooted trust. That sends those measurements up. You usually have some software running on the system that gathers those measurements and then sends those measurements off to a remote verifier, or in some cases a local verifier that can review those measurements. And it's usually comparing those measurements to this reference in integrity manifest. So as we dig into what's actually in the reference integrity manifest and how is that trustworthy, that's where we get into the security audits, like what security due diligence has gone into these reference measurements. And these measurements are usually the digest of the firmware and the software that's running within the trusted computing base of the workload. So it's like, what's gone in to say that this is actually secure? And one of the challenges we've always had when we done, we work with hardware suppliers and we take their firmware and we do an internal review. That was great in an era of trusting the infrastructure for Azure. But when we look at providing or reflecting that same level of trust back to customers, that was a challenge because all of that stuff, all of that security review would have been underneath NDA. So we had some issues. There was no, we could do these point in time reviews from these components that were released to us from various hardware manufacturers, where we get a storage device and then we get firmware that runs mutable code that runs on a storage device. We'd be like, okay, give us the source code. We need to make sure there's no vulnerabilities in it. We'd go do that review. and then we say, okay, it's good to go. And then a couple of months later, we get another, release of firmware because they found a bug, and then we're like, okay, let's go back in and do another review. And scaling that became very, very challenging. And review learnings weren't really being curated by the hardware manufacturer. So we realized our review criteria and on what we would look to as we did internal reviews is the same as like a lot of third-party security review firms that do reviews, and the same as other cloud service providers. So like I mentioned earlier, we would have these, we found out other cloud service providers, Google, Meta, they would do exactly the same thing. They would review all the code that's coming into their environments, and keeping pace with that was tough. And they'd outsource as well some of that work to third-party review providers. And we're like, hey, this is kind of silly what we're doing. We really need to look at left shifting that, so that device manufacturers start to get their code reviewed, and they don't have to come and work with, get multiple reviews and work with each of us kind of individually and go back through the same process of security review. Why don't they just get the review done? We'll set the criteria. We'll create some auditors, a list of controlled auditors where we can make sure that standards are kept high. We can also spot check it to make sure that they're all doing a good job, those security review providers, we call them. And device manufacturers can work kind of one-on-one with the security review provider. And then when they get the device, the firmware on the device, when they get that audited, they can provide us back the final result to show, hey, the device is this firmware release is trustworthy. There's no known security vulnerabilities in it. And then we used Open Compute as the standard to facilitate this framework. This also incidentally got us out of this NDA nightmare where customers would come and say, yeah, we're happy with your confidential compute offering, but we want the same level of insight into the trusted computing base that you have. And that got into a weird NDA place where we'd say, hey, yeah, we reviewed it, but we can't share the results of the review. And it kind of got weird. And this formalizing that process has kind of helped with that, where it's all very transparent. So it's not just for the elite, cloud service providers who can go and do their own reviews, but it's for their customers. So it also gets reflected back to their customers. It's really critical for confidential compute because, of course, all of the security protocols for confidential compute are based on, attestation of the trusted computing base for those environments. So then when we put it all together, this is what we kind of got instead of that, hey, just trust the RIMs that are coming out of the hardware manufacturers. You have the ability now, as devices still roll, the standard root of trust still rolls up those security measurements. It's easier now on the system to bundle those measurements together, and then you're not just looking at reference hash values and trying to parse evidence to understand a little bit about those hash values, but you're actually getting an endorsement that says, hey, if you see this hash value, it's undergone this security conformance. And that was ultimately the goal, is to provide cloud tenants or our customers some assurance that the measurements of their TCB is trustworthy in a meaningful way. And that was the whole goal of OCP Safe and this journey that we've been on. But there's more. There's always more. They never stop. So problems that, hey, we can give you these, you can attest these measurements to you, and you can see exactly what's in your trusted computing base. But of course, attestation at this point in time, it's like, when we go and we look at it and we attest it on day one, When we come back 6 months' time, it's not the same measurements. So, out of station is usually a point in time. And how do we know over the life cycle that we remain secure and we weren't, exposed to a vulnerability for an extended amount of time, or we didn't start at an instance insecure. So it's like, how do they have provenance of events? How do we achieve that in the cloud? And then, of course, how do cloud tenants, assume less trust? That's really what they're after. They want to assume less trust, and we shift that to the hardware. We make the foundational components of the hardware very transparent, so they can see how that works. They can know it's secure. It undergoes security audits itself. This is the silicon, as well as the firmware that's in their environment. But this is where confidential computing really comes in, and I probably don't need to go too deep on this one. I'm sure everybody already understands it's this new model of the protection of data when it's in use through trusted execution environments. I usually talk with customers about this stack. The traditional stack, is vulnerable. The environment, I shouldn't say confidential virtual machine over there. It just should say, general virtual machine. But it's vulnerable to DMA attacks from smart NICs, and some of these IO devices themselves are very, very complex and run a lot of software on them. It can be control plane software that sits out in the smart NIC that has DMA access in and out of the tenant environment. When you start from day one and you have this static measurement of your trusted computing base, it's usually not very valuable, because a lot of the software that runs on a modern system is what we call impactlessly updatable, or it can be serviced and moved from version A to version B to version C. And although your security posture when you're on version A might be very, very good, you move to B, B might inadvertently have a vulnerability in it. And if it hasn't gone through that audit to say, hey, it's actually secure, you just don't know. You can come and you can attest the system when you're on version C, and you go, oh, what have I been exposed to in the past, and when was I exposed? You just don't know. Of course, confidential compute changes the trust boundary here, where it's a really exclusive relationship between the TEE, that smaller TCB, between the TEE, where it's isolated from hypervisor and other IO devices and components in the system, BIOS, BMC, all these other components these TEEs are isolated from. So really great small TCB story for cloud tenants, and I think they definitely gravitate towards that. It's like, who doesn't want more security? Some principles. These are probably a little bit stricter than come out of this organization, but one of the bars that we hold ourselves to, and I call them like first order principles for all of our confidential compute architectures. Those are the devices that we manufacture. We make sure they conform to this, and how we think about TEEs in our environment. And these are the 3 first order principles that we put out there. The code, data, the execution state of the TEE must be cryptographically protected and prevent disclosure from outside the TCB of the TEE. It's a pretty basic pillar around the execution state. Shouldn't be manipulated to expose data. Code, data, and the execution state of the TEE must be immune from interference from outside the TEE. So that's like hypervisor or other software shouldn't be able to manipulate it, that it exposes code or data. And this last principle we put in there is the isolation mechanisms required to establish and preserve the TEE must be cryptographically measured. So we shouldn't have gaps where it's like, hey, you're trusting an SVN, or you don't actually have robust measurement in there. And then the last part of that is it must be available for inspection, and that's where we need to have rigorous audit over it to ensure that it's upholding the security principles. So this is what we strive for in all confidential architectures. Confidential computing, you're all familiar really with this. This is a high-level bullet of what it does. You know, it encrypts and protects data while in use. You know, while in memory, it's encrypted, and then during computation, it's protected from other software outside of the trusted computing base. What does it offer really customers? It offers defense in depth. You know, malicious admins, hackers, access without consent, protects data from self and from the platform. You know, guest OS, host OS kernel, VM admins, VM host, hypervisor, and even physical access to the system. It enables new scenarios too in cloud that previously weren't possible. One of the ones we always talk about is multi-party sharing, where the data itself can be shared between multiple parties without exposing data outside of the contracts that have been pre-negotiated. So it will allow for computation over data and results that have been pre-shared, pre-agreed to be shared with either party. And we see this one's quite popular in in medical industry and in financial industries, where there's certain PII restrictions on credit card data, but they want to share some aspects of the data without trying to parse the data set out themselves. This enables easy sharing. But a more powerful scenario that we've enabled with confidential computing to deliver even more security promise over the top, and we released a paper about this, I believe last year. It was called Trust Code, but it allows for what we call autonomous services. And when we have these trusted execution environments that essentially separate operations from governance, it becomes a very powerful tool to be able to launch services where the cloud service provider can be responsible for the availability of a service, but not responsible for or not able to influence the integrity of that service. And also, true attestation and the steps I discussed prior with that rooted trust, rolling up measurements. It allows for that audibility all the way up to the app level of the service. And then some of the powerful services that can be built with this are transparency services, for one. So services that hold other services accountable for their transparency. And that is one that we have inside Azure. It's a transparency service that is an immutable ledger that records claims about software artifacts. Auditors, like those safe auditors, they can endorse claims and put them on the ledger. It supports RIMs and SBOMs and reproducible bills of artifacts. They get recorded on the ledger. And then the ledger also gives back, receipts of what's been recorded on it. And then in our environment, those receipts are then used to make the artifact deployable. So we in fact have it that artifacts cannot be deployed in the environment unless they've been recorded on the ledger, because always the challenge with blockchain technologies, which are like ledger technologies, is you got to worry about what's not been recorded on the ledger. But by making if we look at the protection mechanisms in the software stack, its digital signature is kind of pervasive throughout it. And that's true even in hardware. So hardware won't ingest firmware that's not digitally signed. And if we make it a prerequisite to obtaining the signature, the digital signature, that's a prerequisite to obtaining that is you have to have a receipt with that shows that the artifact is in fact recorded on a ledger. And that becomes a very powerful tool for providing complete transparency. So of course, if this transparency service is launched within a confidential environment, it upholds those three principles and first order principles I mentioned earlier. An environment's immune from interference from the outside. It creates a trust anchor for building a transparency or very robust audit service. And, when we look at some other audit services out there that are trying to accomplish that, they usually lack this tie to confidential compute and run their environments in, hey, you got to trust the operators of this service and this other transparency service. But when you look, you're usually trusting the operations of the service. In this case, you can launch services that become autonomous. So you're really trusting at that point the code, and the code has been audited. So the chain goes back then to auditors. In some cases, it's audited by multiple auditors. But once you have that initial anchor of that service audited and launched, then it can run and hold other services accountable. And we talk about this, and we've written papers and blogged about this service and even demonstrated it. And underneath for Azure, we have a framework that is the security, the supply chain integrity, transparency, and trust. It's called SCIT. This is the framework for it. The technologies that are behind it, of course, are backed by confidential compute, the CCF framework as well for that ledger technology. And collectively, that's what gives us this e-notary service. This is how it ties in just to firmware for the TCB. So we have device manufacturers that issue, over here in the left, we have these device manufacturers that issue SBOMs and RIMs, as well as the firmware binaries and software and that's going to run on these components. And then we have auditors. They work with these third-party auditors. In this case, it's like OCP Safe. They work with the auditors in OCP Safe. They publish audit reports for the artifacts that they've had audited, and then those move over. We take a pull from those into our confidential ledger. Based on that, we have another signing service that's also a confidential service that signs those artifacts. If they meet the policy that we have applied, those artifacts then become deployable, and only then do they become deployable in our environment. And that's where you'll see a lot of the work that's happening in open compute around dual signature and I think it's called transfer of ownership. But that standard is making sure that every artifact doesn't just take the signature from the device manufacturer, but it also has a secondary owner signature that gets attached to it of equal enforcement. So a device won't accept a firmware payload that's not signed by the device manufacturer and not signed by the owner. And in this case, it's our SCIT transparency service. So that takes us to the end of what I wanted to talk about. I'm sure there's no questions on any of that.
I have a bag of questions, and I never say that.
Yeah, you could have just interrupted me anytime, but yeah, let me hear them.
I will first open it up to the rest of the audience. As chair, I get more than my fair share of time to prod on things.
I may ask a question about one of your initial slides where you showed a cooperation of several companies. You mentioned Microsoft, Google, and AMD. What about the other chip producers? Not naming names.
Yeah, there's a lot more companies are involved in. So the slide that I think you're referring to is the one on Calyptra, which is that open source root of trust, Silicon root of trust. There's a lot more companies involved now. So it's an older slide, but those are the founding companies that are listed on the top on the top. We kind of got together, Microsoft, Google, AMD, and NVIDIA. We got together and kind of aligned on the principle that transparency builds trust, and we wanted to really get to the core of what we're asking customers to trust. And when we're asking them to trust, this hardware root of trust, they don't understand it really. Is attestation to us is easy because we do it every day. We live in this kind of space of really understanding security architecture, and a big part of that is like, we want measurements and attestation. A lot of people aren't in that same space, and one of the things they gravitate to is when they hear it's transparent and it's open, it's kind of showing, hey, there's nothing to hide. And, I think they assume some wise old man has looked at it and made sure it's secure. But when they hear it's transparent, they just gravitate to it. And we move past the conversation of what is it? How do I trust it? That conversation dies right there on, hey, it's fully open. You can go look at it if you want. You can have somebody else look at it. We can show you the audits that have gone into it already. Conversation just dies. It moves on to the next topic. And that's really what my job here is in Azure, is making sure that we deliver on, they say I need to exceed customer expectations. But it's just trying to find out what those are. And it's great when they raise a question or a topic, and it's just already covered. It's when we have gaps or blind spots, that's actually what I go there and like to hear about. But it's also kind of rewarding when we have it already covered. And so get to your question, where are the others? The others are involved. In fact, Calyptra itself is now a leading kind of root of trust technology, in that we see adoption of it been very, I can't talk about people's roadmaps, but been very pervasive. And we're doing there's a great collaboration with storage providers right now on extensions to it for key management storage devices. That's called Lock. And that's, there's some specifications about that already published, but I think the RTL and the firmware for that will be out very soon. Last year, just recently released some quantum resilient cryptography in a thing we call Adams Bridge, which is again just an extension to that core Calyptra, where we build in now quantum resilient cryptography. I think that's top of mind for a lot of people right now, is how do we get quantum resilience. It's top of mind for a confidential compute, right? All of these protocols are going to change. They're all based on classical cryptography. Now we've got to iterate with versions of quantum on top of it. So by collaborating with others in this space, we found that we move a lot quicker in terms of development. The development burden gets shared across collaborators, but also the adoption and the consistency of when companies take it. Like, it's always been, when we went down the standards route and just tried to drive with standards, what we found is people arrive at different times with different implementations, and sometimes horribly inconsistent. And it's kind of funny. Nobody would ever think of going and writing their own crypto library. People would just take OpenSSL, libcrypto. There's a small handful of trust and embed TLS. There's probably like 3, maybe 4 crypto libraries on the planet that people take. When it comes to hardware, in the software world, nobody would even think about writing a crypto library. When it comes to hardware, everybody was rolling their own, and everybody rolls their own. It's kind of like that. The hardware ecosystem, in my view, is like 20 to 30 years behind the software ecosystem in terms of thinking about like transparency and where value really is. And I'll tell you how the customer sees it. And this is a true story, right? So there's about maybe 5 SSD or storage manufacturers that are out there, and we can name them all, right? I'm sure people in this room could probably name at least a couple, right? If I poll 100 Azure customers, I'll be lucky to find one that can name an SSD manufacturer. But they will all tell me that SED and eDrive is not trustworthy. And it's because one of those SSD manufacturers had a security vulnerability, and it resulted in actually a lawsuit, and they remember that. They read the news article on that, and this is what customers remember. They don't remember that, hey, that was actually manufacturer A, and your drives are manufacturer B. When I get into that discussion, they're like, well, how do you know B doesn't have a vulnerability? And I'm like, well, I can't give you guarantees that B doesn't have any vulnerabilities. But so then what it kind of comes down to is that hardware industry, we don't realize it, because we're down in the weeds of competing, but at a top level and where customers are at, the people that are paying, where they're at is we're all whitewashed. We're all in the same bucket. And then by not like, hey, really coming out and delivering on security, we all take damage with that. It's the same. It's actually very same when in cloud. We've always maintained in cloud, it's not good if any of the other cloud service providers have a security vulnerability. That's not good. It's not good. It's not good for our business because it starts to ask questions around, hey, are you exposed to that? Or how do you know you don't have something similar? And it really rattles the ecosystem. So when it comes to security, we kind of have, at least we feel we got a duty to collaborate broadly and really bring it to up level it and bring it to where it needs to be. So that's a long-winded answer for that, but sorry.
Let me just ask a really quick question that you can kind of leave us with an impression. And I don't, we don't need to get into company specific information here. I'm just saying in a typical hyperscaler cloud environment of these reference value measurements, these RIMs that come in there, how many different RIMs from the different device manufacturers do you have to attest to bring up a full node that can run cloud workloads? Top of your head.
Yeah, there's a lot, it depends on the number of devices that are attached and
just an average.
You'd probably have less than 10 for sure, but not much less.
So almost 10. And I think I don't think many of this room would have said a number higher than 2, or at least I wouldn't have until you and I started having conversations. I didn't realize there was that many different manufacturers that are contributing code that is in our TCB.
Yeah. Really, when you start to add devices, it gets out of control. And then inside the RIMs, there's a lot of measurements. There's a lot of components that walk up through that stack. Of course, confidential compute running in a TE, it reduces that significantly. But there's still a bit of code in there too.
Cool. Well, we had a cool talk on baselines around code and the open source libraries that we're all ingesting in our applications. And I think what you talked about really ties into that, because we need baselines around all the stuff that's underneath all those open source libraries, that the stuff that we're standing on that I think we kind of take for granted.
Yeah, and I think reuse is a big one. Like when we get into this auditing and making sure that security due diligence has gone into something, one of the great things that we didn't realize about that is like, hey, if I, at a component level, if I grab this component that's already audited, I build on that. I don't need to go and say, hey, this is now in the TCB, but I know it's secure because it's got this audit on it, and you can build on that. And we didn't expect to see that, but we've seen that, particularly in areas that were trouble, like BMC has been notorious. Because it's a hardware debug controller, so it's got gets a lot of privilege into things. And we didn't expect to see that companies start to cross-use components there and take audits that were done and kind of share that. So it's exciting to see that go.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that was a great talk, Brian. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm glad we were able to get started a little bit early, because clearly we could have kept going on this topic. But thanks once again for speaking. Maybe Garev Ma'agat.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for coming, Brian.